Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are some of the devastating negative effects of climate change, such as glaciers melting, rising seas, and deserts expanding? What is one United Nations agency, namely the UN Environment Program, doing to help raise awareness and to develop solutions to reverse these trends? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at the devastating effects of climate change and what one UN agency is doing to raise awareness. That is the UN Environment Program. My guest today is an expert on that agency. My guest today is Mr. Elliot Harris. Mr. Harris joined the United Nations Environment Program as director of the New York office and as the secretariat of the Environment Management Group in September 2013. Mr. Elliot Harris, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate you being with me today. What exactly is the UN Environment Program? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, was formed following the first UN conference on the human environment that took place in Stockholm in 1972. At around that time in the early 70s, there had been increasing attention being paid to environment issues, but it was a fragmented effort happening in different places, different institutions, and without any form of coordination. UNEP was created at that time with a mandate to be the voice of the environment in the UN system, to become the global environmental authority, to help set a global agenda for environmental matters, and to promote a coordination of effort within the UN system and across the member states on dealing with environmental issues. We've had the privilege of working with member states and with other institutions since our creation in 1972, and we do this in a variety of areas, in assessing environmental trends and the situation at the national and the global level, in providing advice to member states and to our other partners in civil society and in the private sector on environmental issues, and generally advocating for due consideration of environmental matters and their integration into economic and social policy.
And as I mentioned in the opening, climate change will affect all 7.2 billion people. How important is it for us to realize what is happening and why we have to take immediate action?
Climate change is one of the truly global issues. If it is left unchecked, it has a capacity to influence human life in every dimension, in economics, in social policy, down to food security. We cannot escape the consequences of climate change, and we cannot afford not to address it. But we also need to be aware of what it is and what we can each do individually, at the level of the nation state, and globally to prevent it from getting any worse. I think there's an awful lot of understanding of what the phenomenon is. We've had the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The science is there, the evidence is there, and we have a lot of concrete policies that we know can help to mitigate and to change the trends, but we do need to move soon, now, yesterday, to put these policies in place.
Is there a point, do we have a target date? You're right, yesterday was too late. We should really be doing it now. But do we have a target date, 10, 15, 20 years, where we might hit that tipping point that former Vice President Al Gore referenced in his book that really focused attention on this whole issue of climate change to a large degree? But is there a certain date, or are the dates floating around?
The dates are floating around, Bill. Unfortunately, what we have seen is that the greenhouse gas emissions that are at the heart of this problem, they have been increasing, and increasing rapidly, more rapidly than we'd anticipated even as recently as 5 years ago, in large part because of the expansion of economic activity. Countries are growing, and their requirements for energy in particular are rising rapidly. As such, the point in time when we will reach that tipping point beyond which the damage becomes irreversible, That point in time, unfortunately, is coming closer and closer to the present. It's hard to say a specific year because, as I say, the greenhouse gas emissions and the various changes that are affecting the climate, they're happening more rapidly than anticipated. This is all the more reason for us to act now, to stop those trends and eventually reverse them.
And if we don't work on them today, it'll be much more expensive to do it tomorrow, will it not? We cannot let it go until the point where the planet really becomes uninhabitable.
That's quite right. If we do not act now, change will happen, but it'll be disruptive, abrupt change over which we have absolutely no control. And it is going to be prohibitively expensive to deal with. If we act now, we can do it in a controlled, deliberate manner. And we can manage it in a way that keeps it affordable. It's not going to be cheap, but it is manageable, provided we start now and act in a coherent way.
Exactly. Now, some people have argued, they say, well, we need to stay with fossil fuels because we will eliminate coal miners' jobs or people who are working in fracking, whatever the case might be. But there will be other jobs created, will there not? You just don't wipe out an industry and move to another without creating jobs, do you?
That's quite correct. I mean, if we reduce the reliance on coal as a source of energy, we will do so because we are able to replace coal with some other form of energy that is more sustainable, cleaner, renewable. That energy source will itself generate jobs. There may not be enough jobs to completely replace every job that's lost in a brown industry, but we will be making changes, undergoing transformations across the entire range of our activities. And in each of those new areas of activities, there will be new jobs. What is important is that these jobs will be different in nature to the jobs that they replace. There'll be cleaner jobs, there'll be more decent jobs, there'll be healthier jobs, and they will be jobs that will not be threatened by obsolescence in the near future. That's an important point.
It certainly is. And if our viewers would like more information, they can go to www.unep.org.
That's correct.
And learn a lot more about what we're talking about today and what we may not get to today. This issue is, all the issues are important. Employment's important, food production, whatever. But if we lose the planet, we have lost the ball game. It will impact everybody on planet Earth. How do you, as we're in winter right now, as some folks look at this very cold weather that we're having, and by the time this show airs, it may be 70 degrees outside, I'm not sure, but they say, well, look how cold it is, polar vortex and what have you. How do you combat that argument to people who are climate change deniers or even skeptics saying, well, look how cold it is, it can't be happening, there is no climate change?
I think the confusion that arises here is that we're speaking about often global warming, and people look at cold temperatures and say, well, how can it be that there's global warming? That, I think, is shorthand for a larger phenomenon, which is just the change in climate, the change in climatic patterns, in weather patterns. And that is very clearly happening across the globe. There is no region that remains spared from this. It manifests itself in all kinds of different ways. For example, right now in the western United States, you have a very persistent drought that goes well beyond what people have experienced in past decades. It's extremely dangerous, that situation. It affects food production, but it also affects the safety of human beings, their homes. You have situations where the frequency of storms is rising and the intensity of these storms is deepening. All of these are part of the phenomenon of climate change, driven by the global warming phenomenon, but it manifests itself in all sorts of different ways. So it's not enough to simply say it's not getting warmer. What we have to look at is all these other changes that are happening in the climate as a result of the global warming.
And as I remind my friends who do make these comments, I remind them we're only 3 or 4 time zones in the world. There are 20 other time zones that are heating up even more rapidly right now than they would have been. So we have to look at the macro picture and not just say, well, this is what it is. Excuse me. I'm suffering from climate change. I have a very bad cold. But let's talk a little bit about what the UN Environment Program has been doing in the area of mobilizing the world and informing the world. What are you folks involved in conferences, or what have you been doing?
Well, I would say, excuse me, we have a whole range of different activities that we use to raise awareness, to provide advice and policy guidance, and then to support the implementation of policies and programs that protect the environment and that lead towards sustainable development. We organize ourselves in what we call a series of sub-programs. We deal with issues such as climate change. We deal with ecosystems, we deal with conflict and disaster, we deal with environmental governance more generally, and we have an entire program on climate change itself. Within these sub-programs, if you will, we monitor and assess trends and developments at the global level, but also at the regional and the national level. We talk about the types of instruments of policy that governments and other actors can use to address some of the problems that are coming up. We try to help countries to strengthen the institutions that they need to manage environmental policy effectively. And we encourage, above all, people to think of the environment as part of a larger whole, part of the whole approach of sustainable development. It's not the environment on its own, it's not the economy, or it's not social policies on its own. It's all three of them integrated together that will lead to the sustainable development. And we do this in large part through partnerships, not just with governments, not just with other UN agencies, but with concerned actors from all walks of life, different stakeholders, the private sector, civil society, and major groups.
Mm-hmm. Do you find the private sector is getting more involved in this? Do they realize that they're going to be adversely affected? Corporations, businesses that may want to start a plant someplace or use natural resources or sell their product, that with this changing climate, they could very well suffer really immense losses and perhaps may not even be able to operate.
That is exactly correct. A case in point was the recent summit held in New York in September of last year, where the Secretary General convened not only leaders of governments, heads of state, but business leaders, finance leaders, civil society leaders, because increasingly the private sector, in the broad sense, is looking down the road, looking into the future a bit, and they see very clearly the changes that are going on. And they realize that these changes are so fundamental that their business, their activity cannot remain unaffected. Everybody will be affected by this climate change. And so it is in their best interest, as good managers, if you will, to anticipate some of these changes and to see to what extent they can change the way these trends are developing through their own activity and can encourage others to do the same. We know that we're not going to be able to make the changes that we need, the transformational changes that we need, unless we address the way we produce and the way we consume. The private sector is looking very seriously, not all of them yet, but increasingly large parts of the private sector are looking at exactly that. How do we shift the way we produce so that we reuse our resources more effectively and we do not increase our footprint and damage the environment on which we all depend?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at climate change, and we're talking about what can be done to help reverse some of the negative impacts of climate change. My guest today is Mr. Elliot Harris. We'll get it right here in a minute, who is the director of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program. We were talking about, well, you mentioned a minute ago the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and of course, from the day he came in 8+ years ago, almost 9 years ago, one of his main goals was to focus on climate change. Right. How important is it for the CEO of the United Nations, so to speak, a very public figure who works with basically 193 countries of the world in the UN General Assembly? How important is it for him to be involved, as well as the whole UN system to be involved in combating this problem?
I think the first point I'd like to make in this regard is that climate change is really something that is a global issue. There's no one country that can deal with it. There's no one region that is affected by it. We're all affected, and we all have to address it. Countries individually are doing a lot. Agencies individually are doing a lot. Civil society actors individually are doing a lot. But we've got to the point now where the kinds of changes that we need to manage to deal with this problem, they require collective action. The collective action will highlight the efficiency of the individual actions, but we need to deal with it collectively. And so it is perfectly appropriate, and I think highly overdue, that the chief executive of the United Nations system should take that to be one of the guiding principles of his tenure. The UN, as a community of nations, has to address this as a collective issue, and it has to support all of the individual member states as they take the steps to deal with this problem.
Exactly. And we've looked at the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 under discussion now to be adopted at the end of 2015. And number 13 is to take urgent action against climate change. And of course, the UN has been in the forefront of doing that. What would you hope would come out of the conferences that are coming up, one in September. The big conference is in Paris at the end of the year. What would you hope that would come out of that conference to mobilize the world and maybe develop a grand bargain?
Well, let me start first in chronological order with the conference in September. This is going to be the time at which the Community of Nations decides on the framework for a sustainable development agenda going forward. If you will, the extension and the completion of the Millennium Development Goals agenda. Now, that is a universal agenda, and it's critically important that this is an agenda that is applicable to and relevant to every nation on earth. It deals with sustainable development, a large part of which is related directly to the climate change agenda. So, in my view, a successful and ambitious outcome in September will really set the stage for a successful and ambitious outcome in Paris in December at the climate change negotiations. What we need in Paris is an ambitious outcome that generates the kind of agreement to collective action that we need in order to address climate change definitively. As I say, every country on earth virtually has done something to mitigate or to adapt to climate change. But what we need now is a framework that will allow clarity, that will allow predictability, that will set a set of policies that make it possible for the private sector to invest with confidence in sustainable projects, to shift toward the development of the kind of technology that we need in order to manage our resources effectively, reduce our carbon footprint, and sustain the Earth's planetary systems. These are the kinds of challenges that are outstanding, and that is what we need out of the agreement in Paris in December.
And as you mentioned, all countries, to some degree, are working on this really intractable problem, but there's some that are really doing well, like I think of Denmark, which is really across the board in a lot of different areas. Germany's focusing on solar. Are there some best practices out there that we could use, or countries we could look at? I mean, we can't identify all of them today, but there's some ones that we could look at as examples and say, well, if they're doing it, why can't we do it?
Well, yes, I think it's difficult to identify a specific country that is doing everything that should be done at the same time. That's really quite a challenge. But in every area, there are countries that have taken up the challenge and have championed reform, the necessary reforms. If you look at the issue of reforming fossil fuel subsidies, for example, I like to think of the case of Iran, which has taken a rather pervasive system of providing subsidies to consumers of fossil fuels and completely reformed it at tremendous savings to the budget and at a great enhancement of the efficiency of the support that they provide to the population, moving away from generalized subsidies toward more targeted transfers. If you've mentioned the case of Germany with solar energy. If you look at what is going on in China as well, in every 3 years they seem to double their target for renewable energy, the share of renewable energy in their overall energy mix. If you look at some of the small island developing states, many of them have defined a sustainable energy program, a national program for sustainable energy. And the instances abound in all kinds of different areas. Forestry programs, you think of Guyana and the initiatives it has taken to protect its natural forests. So there's much good reason for hope. Countries are doing what needs to be done, and they're doing it in their own self-interest. What we need now is to set a global framework that will encourage all to do it in a collaborative and collective manner.
Exactly. And I know in the United States there are like $4 billion of direct subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, to coal, oil, gas, that type of industry. But as you mentioned, worldwide it's like $500 billion. What could we do with that $500 billion if part of that was taken and subsidized clean energy, green energy, or put into other activities such as building roads or schools or refurbishing the old infrastructure system that we have right now?
That's quite right. I would say it would not be necessary to take the fossil fuel subsidies and subsidize renewable energy. Removing the subsidies alone will even the playing field, and you might find that the private sector is perfectly willing to invest in renewable energy sources based on the expected returns. But those resources, this tremendous amount of money, would be available for making more climate resilient, for example, the economic infrastructure, the roads, the ports, the coastal regions, setting up more efficient and effective electricity grids. There are all kinds of different things that this money could be used for that would each contribute to either reducing the intensity with which we use our resources and enhancing the efficiency of our production and consumption modes. We could conceivably improve public transportation networks that would allow us to wean ourselves away from private motorized transportation and reduce the dependency on fossil fuels. We could, it's virtually limitless when we think of the things we could do, but we could also smooth the transition away from brown industries toward green industries. There will be those who will suffer in that transition. If we have these resources, we can provide retraining, we can help to facilitate that transition from one type of activity to another. And these are things that we should really look at and talk about when we discuss the challenges of transforming the way we consume, the way we produce, and moving toward a green economy.
Exactly. And right now, and by the time the program airs, this may be a moot statement, but we see that oil prices have collapsed. The price of a barrel of oil is down like 47%, 50%, something like that. It may be short term, it may be long term, we don't know just yet. But given that this has put a lot of money back in the consumers' pockets as opposed to profits for the fossil fuel industry, is there some way we could take advantage of this downturn? Should we be looking at maybe adding taxes, not to compensate that total difference, but maybe a nickel a gallon or something like that to get extra money to rebuild the roads, to do the infrastructure development projects, which most countries need at this point, not just the United States, but many other countries around the world. But is there some way to take advantage or to utilize this collapse of energy prices to look at moving away from fossil fuels, really, and to rebuilding our infrastructure?
I think there is. If ever the time is right or suitable for increasing the taxation of a given product, be it fossil fuels or anything else, it would be when the price to the consumer is very low. Because then the additional cost of the taxation is more manageable. It's the same thing if when they're thinking about reducing the subsidies. This might be an appropriate time to do that. I think that it is also a good time to recall that the fact that the energy prices are lower, fossil fuel energy prices are lower, should not delude us into thinking that we can continue to use it as freely as we have done in the past. Not just because the price may go up again in the future, but because we have to be aware that using these fossil fuels exacerbates the problem of global warming through the greenhouse gas emissions and accelerates the process of climate change. So there is a fiscal advantage to taking this opportunity to perhaps correct the way these hydrocarbons are priced through taxation or through a change in the subsidies. But there's also a larger, more long-term reason to just continue to emphasize and to raise awareness that this is a problem that we're going to have to address sooner or later, and it's better to address it sooner. So we should not allow ourselves to be drawn into greater reliance on fossil fuels by simple virtue of the fact that the prices right now are very low.
As you look over the horizon, we see the problems. We see that the UN has played a key role through various conferences, such as the Earth Summit back in 1992, the Sustainable Development Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, the various conferences, bringing really the UN not imposing its will, but bringing the players together to look at this problem and deal with it. But as you look over the horizon, are you optimistic as to how we're going to be able to deal with this?
I'm optimistic for two reasons. One, because in our modern world, with the kind of communications possibilities that we have, it is possible now for each individual to become aware of what is going on around him or herself. We can provide information, we can raise awareness, and we can motivate change. We can motivate changes in mindsets and behaviors, and that's going to be critically important. That's how we're going to get the transformational change. But you see it happening already. All over the world, people are much more aware of what is going on in the environment. People are trying to recycle. People are trying to be more prudent in the use of resources. That's a trend that has begun. Now, politically, it's difficult to take some of the decisions that are needed to reach that collective agreement, to carry the agenda forward in bold terms. But I don't think it is possible now to stop the trend of awareness. And what we find happening is that civil society, that stakeholder groups, that simple individuals in the street are coming together and they are informing themselves and they're making changes in the way they lead their lives, and increasingly they're demanding change from their politicians. Politicians can greatly accelerate the process by agreeing. They can't, however, stop the trend. And my optimism is based in the fact that, there is a lot of awareness of what needs to be done. And increasingly, private individuals, have a range of options that they can use to make the changes in their own way of living, in their own lifestyles, and then increasingly to demand that their politicians, that their political leaders, do what is necessary at the global level.
Exactly, and we all have a role to play, and we have to play it. But Mr. Elliot Harris, the head of the United Nations Environment Program in New York, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill, for having me.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.